The DNA test results lay scattered across our kitchen table like a bomb that had just exploded. None of them, not a single one. Mark's voice was hollow as he stared at the papers. Emma, 8 years old, Sophie, 6, little James, who just turned 4. 3 beautiful children who had called him daddy their entire lives. And according to the test results, not one of them was his. I stood frozen in the doorway, my coffee mug trembling in my hands. I'd known this day might come eventually, but I'd always told myself it never would. That Mark would never question it, that the secret would stay buried forever. Jessica, he said, his voice cracking, look at me. I forced myself to meet his eyes. They were red-rimmed, devastated, but underneath the pain I could see something else building. Rage. How long, he whispered. I wanted to lie, God, how I wanted to lie, but what was the point now? The evidence was right there in black and white. Since before Emma was born, I said quietly. Mark's face went completely white. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned pale. 10 years, for 10 fucking years, you let me believe, his voice broke. I changed their diapers, Jessica. I stayed up all night when they were sick. I taught Emma to ride a bike. I read them bedtime stories every single night. Mark, please. Who is he? The shout was so loud that I heard Emma's footsteps upstairs pause. I closed my eyes. There was no going back now. Daniel. Mark stared at me like I'd just stabbed him. Daniel, my brother Daniel. I nodded, feeling tears start to stream down my face. Mark stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward with a crash. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he turned and punched the wall so hard that his knuckles split open and left a hole in the drywall. 10 years, he repeated, almost to himself. 10 years I've been raising his children. 10 years I've been working 60-hour weeks to support his fucking family. He turned back to me, and the look in his eyes made me take a step backward. Where is he, Jessica? Where's my dear brother Daniel? I didn't answer, but Mark already knew. Daniel had been staying in our guest house for the past 3 months, supposedly getting back on his feet after his divorce. Mark had insisted on helping him, being the good brother he'd always been. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. Mark walked out of the kitchen, and I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, then the guest house door slamming so hard it shook the windows. I sank into a chair and buried my face in my hands. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Mark was supposed to be the stable one, the provider, the reliable husband who never questioned anything. Daniel was supposed to be the excitement, the passion, the escape from my mundane married life. I never meant for it to go on this long. It was supposed to be a brief affair, just something to make me feel alive again. But then I got pregnant with Emma, and I didn't know whose baby she was. When she was born with Mark's dark hair and eyes, it seemed like a sign that I should stay quiet. Then there was Sophie, who looked like neither Mark nor Daniel but had my mother's features. And James, who was clearly Daniel's with his distinctive green eyes, but Mark never seemed to notice. I'd convinced myself that Mark was happy, that ignorance was bliss, that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. I was wrong. The shouting from the guest house was loud enough to wake the neighbors. I heard glass breaking, furniture overturning, and Mark's voice screaming accusations I couldn't quite make out. Then silence. A few minutes later, Mark came back into the house. His shirt was torn, there was blood on his knuckles from both the wall and Daniel, and his eyes had a wild look I'd never seen before. Pack your things, he said calmly. You and the kids, you have 1 hour. Mark, we need to talk about this. Talk? He laughed, and it was the most bitter sound I'd ever heard. Jessica, you've been lying to me for a decade. You've let me pour my heart, my soul, my money, my entire life into children that aren't even mine. What exactly is there to talk about? They may not be yours biologically, but you're still their father. You raised them. They love you. They love the man who was stupid enough to believe their mother's lies. Mark's voice was ice cold. They love a fool, and that fool is about to disappear forever. What do you mean? Mark pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. Bank transfer. Our entire savings account $127,000 transferred to some account I didn't recognize. Mark, what did you do? I liquidated everything. The savings, the retirement funds, the kids' college accounts, all of it. My heart stopped. That money was for the children's future. What children? Mark's smile was terrifying. I don't have any children, remember? According to you and Daniel, I never did. You can't just watch me. He held up another document. Divorce papers. I'm citing adultery and fraud. I'm demanding full custody of no one since they're not my kids. I'm claiming no responsibility for child support since I was deceived about paternity. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mark, you're destroying their lives too. This isn't their fault. No, Jessica, you destroyed their lives. I'm just making sure I don't go down with the ship you built. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Mark hired the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city and proceeded to systematically dismantle the life we'd built together. He contested everything, the house, the cars, even the furniture. Since the children weren't biologically his, he argued, he had no legal obligation to support them. He was right. Daniel, meanwhile, had disappeared the night of the confrontation. Mark had beaten him badly enough that he'd needed stitches, and he'd apparently decided that staying around wasn't worth the risk. He left town without a word to me or the kids. So there I was, a single mother of 3 with no support system, no savings, and no income. Mark had been the breadwinner while I stayed home with the kids. My part-time job at the boutique barely covered groceries, let alone rent. The kids didn't understand what was happening. One day Daddy was there and the next day he was gone. Emma kept asking when he was coming home. Sophie cried herself to sleep every night. James kept looking for him around every corner. Where's Daddy? Became the question that haunted my days. I tried to explain, but how do you tell an 8-year-old that the man she's called father her entire life isn't actually related to her? How do you tell a 6-year-old that mommy's lies have destroyed the only family she's ever known? Meanwhile, Mark was spiraling. I heard about it through mutual friends. He'd quit his job at the accounting firm where he'd worked for 12 years. He'd started drinking heavily. He'd moved into a cheap apartment across town and was apparently living like a hermit. He's telling everyone who will listen about what you did, my friend Sarah told me over coffee. It's like he's on a mission to destroy your reputation along with his own life. She wasn't exaggerating. Mark had posted everything on social media, the DNA test results, the timeline of my affair, even photos of Daniel with the kids that made the resemblance obvious. The story had gone viral in our small town. Everyone knew. I couldn't go anywhere without whispers following me. The grocery store, the kids' school, even church, everywhere I went, people stared and whispered. But the worst part was that Mark wasn't wrong. I had lied. I had deceived him. I had let him build his entire life around children that weren't his. I just never thought he'd be willing to destroy himself to make me pay for it. 3 months after the confrontation, I got a call from the hospital. Mark had been found unconscious in his apartment, empty bottles of prescription painkillers and whiskey on the nightstand beside him. Suicide attempt. They'd pumped his stomach and stabilized him, but he was asking for me. I left the kids with my mother and drove to the hospital, my hands shaking the entire way. Mark looked terrible. He'd lost at least 30 pounds, his hair was unkempt and his eyes were hollow. But when he saw me walk into his room, he actually smiled. Jessica, I was wondering if you'd come. Mark, I'm so sorry, I never wanted. Shut up, his voice was weak but firm. I didn't ask you here to apologize, I asked you here to explain something. He gestured to the bedside table, where a letter was waiting. That's my suicide note, want to know what it says? I shook my head, but he continued anyway. It explains everything, how you lied to me for 10 years, how you let me raise another man's children, how you destroyed my ability to trust anyone ever again. His smile grew wider, more unsettling, but most importantly, it explains how I'm leaving everything to charity. Everything. The house is in foreclosure because I stopped paying the mortgage. The cars are being repossessed. I cashed out my life insurance policy and donated it all to a children's foundation. Ironic, right? I'm helping kids who actually need it instead of the ones who were never mine. I felt sick. Mark, the house, that's where the kids live, that's their home. Not anymore. Mark's laugh was hollow. You see, Jessica, I realized something in these past few months. You didn't just steal 10 years of my life. You stole my ability to have a real family. I'm 42 years old. What woman is going to want a man who was stupid enough to be fooled for a decade? That's not true. It is true, you took away my chance to have children of my own, to build a real family, to trust anyone completely. So I decided that if I can't have the life I thought I had, then nobody gets anything. He pointed to another document on the table. That's a letter to Child Protective Services. I've reported you for fraud and child endangerment. Turns out letting your kids believe a lie about their father's identity can be considered psychological abuse. My blood turned to ice. You wouldn't. I already did. They'll be investigating soon. And Jessica, when they find out that you knowingly deceived me about paternity to secure financial support, and that Daniel abandoned his biological children, well, let's just say the kids might be better off in foster care. I stared at him in horror. Mark, they're innocent in all this, please don't. They're not my problem anymore. Mark closed his eyes. You made sure of that. The machines around his bed beeped steadily as I realized the full scope of what he was doing. He wasn't just destroying his own life. He was making sure that my lies cost everyone everything. Mark didn't die that night, but in many ways the man I'd married did. He survived the suicide attempt, spent a month in psychiatric care, and emerged as someone completely different. Colder, more calculating, more determined to make sure I paid for what I'd done. The CPS investigation was thorough and humiliating. They interviewed the kids, me, teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have information about our family situation. The fact that Daniel had abandoned his biological children didn't help my case. Meanwhile, Mark began systematically dismantling every safety net I had left. He contacted my employer and showed them the social media posts about my affair and lies. I was fired for turpitude and bringing disrepute to the company image. He reached out to my parents and Daniel's parents, making sure they all knew the full truth about the children's parentage. Both sets of grandparents were devastated, and the financial support they'd been providing stopped immediately. He even went to the kids' school and requested that all emergency contact information be updated to remove him completely. Emma came home crying one day because the school had told her that Daddy wasn't allowed to pick her up anymore. But the cruelest thing he did was the photo album. Mark had always been meticulous about documenting our family life. He had thousands of photos of the kids, first steps, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Photos that showed 10 years of genuine love and joy. He printed them all out and sent them to me in a box with a note. Since these memories are all based on lies, I thought you should have them. I won't be needing reminders of my stupidity. Looking through those photos was torture. Every image showed Mark's genuine happiness, his pride in the children he thought were his. Emma on his shoulders at the zoo, Sophie teaching him to braid her hair, James taking his first steps into Mark's waiting arms. He had loved them completely, and my lies had poisoned all of it. 6 months after the DNA test revelation, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town with my 3 confused and heartbroken children. Mark had followed through on every threat. The house was gone, the cars were gone, the savings were gone. I was working double shifts at a diner just to keep the lights on, and the kids barely saw me anymore. Emma had started acting out at school, getting into fights and refusing to do her homework. Sophie had developed anxiety so severe that she threw up every morning before school. James kept asking for real daddy and couldn't understand why the man who'd raised him had suddenly vanished. I tried to reach out to Daniel, but he'd moved to another state and changed his phone number. The man who was actually their father wanted nothing to do with the children he'd helped create. That's when I realized the true scope of Mark's revenge. He hadn't just punished me. He'd systematically removed every source of stability and support from his children's lives, children who had loved him unconditionally and didn't deserve to suffer for my mistakes. But the worst part was that I understood why he'd done it. I'd stolen 10 years of his life. I'd let him pour his heart into children who weren't his while their real father got to play the fun uncle with no responsibilities. I'd made him invest his entire identity in being a father, then ripped that identity away with scientific proof. Mark had every right to be furious. He had every right to want me to suffer. But the children, they'd done nothing wrong, and he was destroying them too. One evening, about 8 months after everything fell apart, I was putting James to bed when he asked the question that broke my heart completely. "Mommy, why doesn't real daddy love us anymore?" I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that the man who raised him with infinite patience and love had discovered he wasn't biologically related and decided that blood was more important than bonds? "He does love you, sweetheart, he's just hurt right now." "But when will he stop being hurt? When can he come home?" I kissed his forehead and turned off the light, but I couldn't answer. Because the truth was that Mark would probably never stop being hurt, and he would definitely never come home. That night, after the kids were asleep, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I drove to Mark's apartment. He lived in a rundown complex on the wrong side of town now, a far cry from the beautiful home we'd shared. When he answered the door, I barely recognized him. He'd lost even more weight and looked years older. His clothes were wrinkled, his apartment was a mess, and I could smell alcohol on his breath even though it was only 8 p.m. "What do you want, Jessica?" "I want to talk about the kids." Mark laughed bitterly. "What kids? I don't have kids, remember." "They miss you, Mark." Emma cries herself to sleep asking for her daddy. "Sophie won't eat because she says food doesn't taste good without you there. James keeps looking for you everywhere we go." "That's not my problem anymore. They love you, whatever my mistakes were, they love you." Mark's face darkened. "They love a lie, Jessica. They love the idea of a father who doesn't actually exist. I was playing a role in your elaborate deception for 10 years. Now the show's over. You're their father in every way that matters." "Biology matters?" Mark's voice rose to a shout. "DNA matters, truth matters. You stole my chance to have real children, Jessica. You stole my chance to pass on my genes, my legacy, my family name. You made me into a fucking cuckold for a decade." I flinched at the venom in his voice. "So no," he continued, "I don't care if they miss me. I don't care if they're confused or hurt or damaged by this. You created this situation. You deal with the consequences. What about you, Mark? Are you happy now? Is this revenge making you feel better?" Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring at me with those hollow eyes. "No," he said finally, "I'm not happy. I don't think I'll ever be happy again, but at least I'm not living a lie anymore. At least I'm not being made a fool of every single day." "So you'd rather destroy yourself than forgive me?" "I'd rather destroy everything than pretend it was real." That conversation haunted me for weeks. Mark was systematically dismantling his own life out of spite, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. He'd lost his job, his home, his health, his relationships with the children who'd adored him. He was drinking himself to death in a dingy apartment, nursing his rage like it was the only thing keeping him alive. And maybe it was. I started seeing a therapist, desperate to understand how my marriage had become this catastrophic. Dr. Martinez was a kind woman who helped me work through the guilt and the regret, but she also forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths. "Jessica, you say you never meant for the affair to go on this long, but you made a choice every single day for 10 years to continue the deception. You made a choice every time Mark expressed love for those children to stay silent." "I was scared," I said. "I was scared of losing my family." "But it wasn't really your family, was it? You'd built it on a foundation of lies. When that foundation cracked, everything collapsed." She was right. I'd been so focused on maintaining the illusion that I'd never considered the damage it would cause when the truth inevitably came out. "What Mark is doing now, is that your fault too?" I asked. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Mark is responsible for his own choices, just like you were responsible for yours, but you created the situation that drove him to make those choices. The question is, what are you going to do now to protect your children from the fallout?" That was the question that kept me awake at night. My children were suffering because of both my lies and Mark's revenge, but I was the only parent they had left who was willing to take care of them. Daniel had made it clear he wanted no part of fatherhood. Mark had made it clear he considered them strangers. That left only me to pick up the pieces. 1 year after the DNA test revelation, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I stopped trying to get Mark back. For months, I'd been hoping that time would heal his wounds, that he'd remember the love he'd felt for the children and want to be part of their lives again. I'd been waiting for him to forgive me, to recognize that our family was worth saving despite its flawed foundation. But Dr. Martinez helped me realize that I was still being selfish. I was prioritizing my own guilt and desire for redemption over what was actually best for my children. The truth was that Mark had become toxic. His pain had transformed into something cruel and destructive, and he was determined to hurt everyone around him. Letting him back into the children's lives would only cause more damage. So I stopped calling him, I stopped driving by his apartment, I stopped hoping. Instead, I focused on building a new life for my kids. I enrolled them in family therapy to help them process the loss of the only father they'd ever known. I found a better job with more stable hours so I could be present for them. I started dating again, not to replace Mark, but to show my children that healthy relationships were possible. Emma's grades improved, Sophie's anxiety decreased, James stopped asking about real daddy every day. We were healing. But Mark wasn't. I heard about Mark's final self-destruction through our mutual friend Sarah. He'd been arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace after showing up drunk at his former workplace and screaming about how his ex-wife had stolen his life. He'd been fired from his new job at a gas station for the same behavior. His landlord had evicted him for unpaid rent, and he'd been living in his car for 2 weeks before the arrest. The police had called me as his emergency contact, asking if I could pick him up from jail. I said no. "Jessica, he's clearly having a mental health crisis," Sarah said when she called to tell me about it. "Don't you think you owe him some help after what you put him through?" "I put him through betrayal and lies," I said. "I didn't put him through self-destruction. He chose that path himself." "But if you hadn't? If I hadn't lied, maybe we would have gotten divorced 10 years ago and everyone would have been better off. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I made terrible choices and then Mark made terrible choices in response. I can't fix his choices, Sarah. I can only fix my own." "What about the kids? Don't they deserve to know their father is struggling?" I thought about that question for a long time. Emma was now 9 and had finally stopped having nightmares about Mark disappearing. Sophie was 7 and had made new friends at school. James was 5 and was learning to call my new boyfriend Papa Mike when he felt like it. They were building new attachments, new sources of security and love. Was it fair to reintroduce the chaos of Mark's self-destruction into their lives? "Their father is the man who raised them with love and patience for years," I told Sarah. "That man is gone. The person who exists now is just someone who shares Mark's name and face. And that person is too dangerous to be around my children." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You've gotten cold, Jessica." "No," I said, "I've gotten protective." 2 years after the DNA test, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Mark, written in handwriting I barely recognized, shaky and uncertain, nothing like the confident script I remembered. "Jessica, I'm writing this from a rehabilitation facility in Portland. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but there are things I need to say before I can move forward with my life. I've been sober for 3 months now, and I've been working with a therapist to understand what happened to me after I found out about the kids. She says I had a complete psychological break. She says that the depth of my love for Emma, Sophie, and James made the betrayal so devastating that I couldn't process it rationally. I want you to know that I understand now that what I did was wrong. Not just wrong to you, but wrong to 3 innocent children who never asked to be born into this situation. They loved me, and I loved them, and none of that was fake just because we don't share DNA. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking to see them. I understand that I burned those bridges so thoroughly that there's no way back. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. And I want you to tell them when they're old enough to understand that their daddy loved them with everything he had. That every moment of joy I showed them was real. That if I could go back and handle things differently, I would choose love over revenge every time. I'm working now as a counselor for other men who have discovered paternity fraud. I'm trying to help them avoid the path I took. I'm trying to turn my worst experience into something that can help other families stay together instead of falling apart. I hope you and the kids are happy. I hope you've found peace. And I hope that someday when the pain fades, you'll remember that we did have some good years together. Before the lies, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart, we were happy once. Take care of them, Jessica. They deserve better than both of us gave them, Mark. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in my jewelry box next to my old wedding ring. I never responded, but I kept it. Because someday, when Emma, Sophie, and James are adults, they might want to know that the man who raised them had found his way back to love, even if it was too late for our family. 5 years after the DNA test revelation, I married Mike. He's a good man, patient, kind, stable in all the ways that matter. He knows the whole story about Mark and Daniel and the kids' parentage, and he loves them anyway. Not because he's trying to replace their father, but because he chose our family knowing exactly what he was getting into. Emma is 13 now and occasionally asks questions about Mark. I tell her the truth, that he loved her very much but got sick after finding out she wasn't biologically his, and that sometimes when adults get that kind of sick, they can't be around the people they love anymore. Sophie is 11 and has embraced Mike completely. She calls him dad and seems to have made peace with the fact that her biological father isn't part of her life. James is 9 and barely remembers Mark anymore. To him, Mike has always been his father, and that's enough. We're happy, not perfectly happy. There are still scars from what happened, still questions that will need to be answered as the kids get older. But we're stable and secure and honest with each other. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd told Mark the truth from the beginning. If I'd confessed about Daniel right after Emma was born or even before she was conceived. Maybe we would have gotten divorced, but maybe we could have worked out a co-parenting arrangement. Maybe Mark could have chosen to stay in the children's lives even knowing they weren't biologically his. Maybe Daniel would have stepped up and been a real father. Maybe, but there's no point in dwelling on maybes. I made choices, Mark made choices, Daniel made choices, and 3 innocent children paid the price for all of our bad decisions. But they're resilient and they're loved and they're going to be okay. As for Mark, I don't know where he is now or how he's doing. I hope he found peace. I hope he found love again. I hope he learned to forgive himself for the things he did in his pain. But mostly, I hope he learned that some forms of revenge end up destroying the person seeking it more than the person they're trying to punish. Because in the end, Mark didn't just discover that his kids weren't actually his. He discovered that his need for revenge was stronger than his love for them. And that discovery destroyed him more completely than my affair ever could have. 10 years have passed since the DNA test changed everything. Emma is 18 now, about to start college. She's bright and strong and has decided she wants to study psychology, partly because she wants to understand what happened to our family. Sophie is 16 and has inherited Mike's love of music. She plays violin in the school orchestra and writes songs about healing and forgiveness. James is 14 and looks more like Daniel every day, but he has Mike's gentle personality and my stubborn streak. He's never expressed any interest in finding his biological father. Last month, Emma asked if she could reach out to Mark. I've been thinking about him a lot, she said. I know what he did was wrong, but I also understand that you hurt him badly. I want to know if he's okay. I want him to know that I don't hate him. Part of me wanted to say no to protect her from potential rejection or disappointment. But Emma is an adult now, and she has the right to make her own choices about relationships. I gave her the last address I had for Mark, from the letter he'd sent 5 years ago. She wrote to him, he wrote back. They've been corresponding for a few months now, tentative, careful letters that focus mostly on her life and his work as a counselor. He's remarried to a woman who has 2 children from a previous marriage. He's learned to be a stepfather, to love children who aren't biologically his. Emma asked if I was okay with her having a relationship with him. He's not my dad anymore, she said. You and Mike made sure I knew that, but he was my dad once and those years were real even if the foundation was false. I want to forgive him, Mom. I think we both need that. I told her yes. Because the truth is, Mark was right about one thing: biology doesn't determine love, but honesty does. And I've spent the last 10 years teaching my children that truth matters, that lies have consequences, and that love requires making hard choices. If Emma chooses to forgive Mark, that's her choice to make. If she chooses to rebuild a relationship with him, I'll support her. But I'll also make sure she understands that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, that loving someone doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. Most importantly, I'll make sure she knows that family isn't just about blood or history or even love. It's about choosing to show up for each other every day with honesty and commitment and grace. Mark discovered his kids weren't actually his. I discovered that my lies had consequences I never imagined. Daniel discovered that running away doesn't solve anything. But my children discovered something more important: that they could survive the worst thing that ever happened to their family and build something better from the wreckage. And maybe that's the most important discovery of all. From now on, I shall be untouched by spring and autumn, and detached from romance and worldly beauty. Did you enjoy this story of family secrets and devastating consequences? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our emotional stories. Write in the comments: do you think Jessica deserved what happened, or did Mark go too far in his revenge? See you in the next story.